There are houses whose names weigh more than iron, whose sigils seem to outlast the very stone on which they are carved, and yet whose blood, if pricked from the fingertip, is as red and warm as any petty crofter's. The Targaryens are such a house, though their wine-dark legends would have them otherwise. The mystery that has compelled my quill is not whether dragons once flew nor whether kings wore crowns carved to fit the brow of destiny. It is, more simply, what it means to possess the blood of the dragon, what the phrase owed to custom, to law, to appetite, to fear, and how that blood was tended, pruned, and sometimes diluted across the centuries until it became as much a charge laid on the conscience as an inheritance left in the cradle. We are told the blood made them singular. We are shown, again and again, how being singular made them perilous. Between those claims lies my subject. When we turn to origins, we find at once the fog. The Valyrian freehold kept records, but they were not set down for the comfort of future scholars in Old Town. Much of what we have are shards. Fragments of ledger and temple votive ruined by fire, scratched ship's tallies in high Valyrian cursive, and the recollections of slaves who fled the doom but not the habit of silence. The name Targaryen appears in those remnants not as conquerors yet, but as one among many dragonlord lineages. Not of the greatest consortiums, if an archmaester once observed rightly, but of a middling house whose fortunes crested with uncanny prescience. The exodus from the freehold to Dragonstone, Enar's flight at the counsel of his daughter, called Daenerys the Dreamer, stands as the first certain moment where the bloodline becomes its own steward. He exchanged marble for black basalt, one chronicler wrote, and an empire for a fortress at the edge of storms. He saved his blood and lost his world, so the story is told. Whether Daenerys' visions were truly granted by gods, prudence clothed in superstition, or merely one shrewd family seizing an excuse to escape rivalries in the mists of guise, the result is the same. The bloodline preserved itself by retreating from its origin. It was on Dragonstone, that smoky Enville in the narrow sea, that the language of blood hardened into habit. Sources from those early years are scarce. The castle's own archives suffered from salt, inattentive stewards, and the appetites of mice. Yet certain patterns glimmer even through eroded ink. Kin wed kin more rigidly than the freehold demanded, as one maester who catalogued marriage contracts noted with a touch of queasiness. They kept close to other Valyrian-descended families, the Valerians of Driftmark, the Celtigars of Claw Isle, thus ensuring that when blood mingled, it mingled with cousins of the fire rather than with the soft clay of Undul's newly landed or first men still clinging to old gods. The dragons they had brought were few but formidable. When Balerion, Vagor, and Meraxes are first named, we hear something like the thunder of inevitability. Yet creatures as mighty as mountains are not proof against time. A hatchling that perishes unnamed teaches as much about fragility as a king's one son dead in a cradle teaches about the limits of succession. Already the Targaryens were learning that rarity demands ritual, and ritual grows stricter the more fragile its object becomes. From Dragonstone to domination is a narrow sound and a long arm. Aegon, called the Conqueror, chose to claim the Greenlands not simply because he could set cities alight from a saddle, but because an idea had ripened among his kin, that the blood of the dragon was licensed to order other bloods. He married both his sisters, a choice older than the faith and stouter than their priests' objections. There are kings who wed to unite rivers, an Old Town prelate muttered in a diary still kept in our stacks. And there are kings who wed to keep the river from flowing elsewhere. The first great institution to be shaped by the bloodline, then, was not the Iron Throne itself but the marriage bed that sat beneath it. In making incest an emblem of sovereign exemption, the Targaryens announced that their blood was both fragile and holy, fragile enough to justify strange protection, holy enough to scorn the law that binds mortal men. Polygamy under Aegon, achieved without apology, reinforced the lesson. If the blood needed many vessels, queenly and otherwise, it would have them. From this vantage, I would emphasize the distinction between lineages and institutions. Lineages are the map of begettings and bequests. Institutions are the rules and rooms that shape them. The Targaryen line was never a simple braid, not even at the beginning. Aegon's two sisters stood at his shoulders, and in their wombs lay rival futures. The institution of the Kingsguard, 7 sworn to die before letting royal blood be lost, may be traced, as one white-clad brother has written, to the Conqueror's own wars and their aftermath, though others argue the order settled into its present sanctity under Jaehaerys. Either way, its purpose was plain. The blood required a wall of lives. The faith militant, rising in fury against incestuous license, created a counter-institution, the sword and the star, until that too was broken or bought off. The bookkeepers of the Red Keep began in these reigns to amend an already old tome with a new, fussy diligence. The book of lineages and histories of the great houses records whose body delivered whose inheritance, and if one reads its tidy strokes with a cynical eye, one sees the iron nails that keep the Targaryen story fastened to the wall even when the wood groans. Yet the Targaryens of Aegon and Aenys and Maegor invite a caution that belongs to all dynastic studies. The more one insists on purity, the more medicine one must swallow. Aenys, gentle and seemingly unsuited to the edge of things, begot question after question more deftly than answers. Maegor, called cruel, solved. Questions with heads on spikes and brides displayed like trophies of a hunt. Neither man secured the bloodline. What steadied it was not terror nor indulgence, but the long labor of Jaehaerys I and Alysanne, whose reign made law a companion to blood instead of its helpless attendant. It was under them, as Septon Barth wrote with quill both careful and daring, that a compromise with the faith stamped the royal marriage as a sanctified exception. Incest would be tolerated in a family anointed for rule and nowhere else. This was a bargain struck not in triumph but necessity. The price was paid in whispers and in miscarriages, in all the quiet tragedies that follow any bargain made against the body's own arithmetic. Genealogists worship clarity, but in the Targaryen record clarity keeps company with contradiction. Consider the Great Council at Harrenhal in 101 AC, that festival of parchment where a kingdom was invited to draft a family tree according to its own sense of order. Jaehaerys, old and weary of funerals, asked the realm to choose between claims. Would the bloodline flow through Rhaenys, married into the Velaryons and mother of a boy whose own father gave the sea more loyalty than the throne, or through Baelin's son Viserys, who carried the older custom of preferring the male line? The realm chose Viserys. The choice created law, and the law created expectation, and expectation, when men have swords, creates wars. Yet it is striking that the Great Council could reach for principle only by grasping at precedent. As one maester who studied the transcripts complained, the lords wanted a rule that might be praised in sermons and broken in practice. In choosing Viserys, they preferred process to blood, or at least they preferred a blood they could predict. The reign of Viserys I and the quarrel over his succession forged a crucible both for blood and for the telling of blood. Rhaenyra, named heir, bore sons whose coloring stirred courtly tongues. Mushroom swore to sins in bedchambers. Septon Eustace swore to truths fit for the altar. A maester swore to what his patron wished. The boys were christened princes of the blood, while men whispered the name of Harwin Strong and counted noses in torchlight. On the other side, Aegon too stood armored in the Great Council's recent memory, the weight of half a century's magistracy at his back. When historians argue the dance of the dragons, they often pretend to settle whether those boys were or were not true in the writ of nature. I can only report the observable. The realm treated them as true until it no longer suited the knights who meant to wear their colors. Genealogy did not collapse. It was murdered. The dance forces us to confront a phenomenon that polite pens would rather ignore: the proliferation of dragon seed. If dragons bond best with those of the blood, why did fishermen's sons and washerwomen's daughters mount beasts long untamed? Adam of Hull called Velaryon in the end. Ulf the White, Hugh Hammer, Nettles, whose name holds more pride than a dozen highborn syllables. Each stood astride proof that the blood of the dragon was a wider thing than court wished to admit. As one scurrilous singer laughed in a verse only the taverns preserved, for a dragon to be born, a lord must visit often and the candles must fail. There is a darker reading. The dragons themselves may have been the institution stronger than any marriage bed, choosing where to fasten fate and thus asserting the unwritten law that blood is what blood does. For the prim clerks of the Red Keep, this was sheer disorder, and many a name that could not be stomached by noble readers was blotted out rather than kept. It is not neat, then, to lay out a chronology, but neatness is precisely what a chronicle demands. Beginning with Enar's flight and the founding on Dragonstone, we pass by a generation of consolidation. Aegon the Conqueror crosses, marries his sisters openly, and mounts a throne hammered into awe from the tools of the vanquished. Aenys inherits and gives offense to both parties in every argument. Too yielding for the iron, too proud for the star. Maegor usurps, reigns by fear and force, and dies with as little posterity as a tempest. Jaehaerys I, by a miracle of patience and the counsel of Alysanne and the genius of Barth, braids law and realm and blood into a rope strong enough to pull the 7 kingdoms through a generation of relative peace. The Great Council of 101 plants a seed that will later flower in thorn. Viserys I epitomizes the rule that a kind man may yet decide the worst problem by refusing to admit its shape. The dance comes, dragons die, the red keep's nursery empties. Aegon III carries sorrow like a cloak and watches the last of the old fire gutter, the line of dragon riders becoming instead a line of kings whose treasure is memory. From there, the bloodline is innumerable, perhaps because the absence of dragons encourages multiplication. Daeron I throws himself against Dorne and dies young and ambitious. Baelor the Blessed turns piety into policy and nearly turns his line into a cul-de-sac. His lack of issue forces Viserys too forward, a prince who knew the weight of ledgers and the limits of piety. Aegon IV, called unworthy by those who savor simple labels, fathers as if he meant to drown the realm in his seed and then, in a gesture of astonishing improvidence, acknowledges most of his bastards as true. Thus are born the Blackfyre rebellions, which are properly understood not as eruptions of illegitimacy but as contests of symbology. Daemon Blackfyre wielded a sword as if it were a document, and many who could not read letters could read that blade's curve. Daeron II, who had the sense to wed Dorne to the crown rather than crush it, labored to bequeath a future in which law stands higher than steel. Yet law needs enforcement, and enforcement requires men, and men have loyalties more varied than any active attainder can anticipate. As the line moves into the shadowed years of plagues and fevers, the great spring sickness refusing to show respect for royal nursery or poorhouse, the thesis that blood confers protection finally shatters. Aerys I trusts in wizards and signs. Mikar I commands with a soldier's impatience and leaves a tangle when he dies. That tangle is the Great Council of 233, where a boy once called Egg is lifted from the hedge to the throne, to the great confusion of those who think royal blood may not be found in mud. Aegon V tried to relieve the burdens that lineage lays on the small folk. Lower taxes, softened feudal extortions, the restoration of rights men had forgotten they possessed. Yet even he could not rest from dreams of fire. At Summerhall he set long-dormant rights ablaze, hoping that Dragon's return would correct the drift of fortune. The fire caught more quickly than the dream. We are told a storm came up and men ran into it. We are told a song was sung. We are told nearly everything save the exact pattern of grief. But who can deny that, in attempting to fortify the bloodline with fire, he became its own ash? The War of Ninepenny Kings, fought under Jaehaerys II, tidied away the Blackfyre challenge by killing Meleys, last of that unruly branch. The bloodline enjoyed something like a sigh. In that sigh, Aerys II was conceived and crowned. Marriage narrowed its walls again. Brother to sister, repeating an old solution offered to a new world. Aerys early in his reign showed promise. Later he displayed the terrible mirror of that promise, as if the glass shattered and he tried to rule by cutting those who looked in. Children followed, and with them the logic that every Targaryen father seems to revisit at least once. Save the line, whatever the cost. Rhaegar was born with a face that poets praised and a gravity that made poets unnecessary. He read prophecies as if they were ledgers. He believed the seed of salvation lay in a cradle, a sworn brother who kept watch on his journey's road. And like all princes who hoped to fulfill a song, he took up a harp and a sword. He married Princess Elia of Dorne, had issue, and then, according to which witness you prefer, stole away or rode away with Lyanna Stark, whose roses proved thorns for a realm. The rebellion that unmade Aerys II did not end the Targaryen bloodline. Bloodlines almost never end. They diffuse, blur, re-emerge in unexpected forms. Robert Baratheon claimed by right of war and by a genealogy that bound his house to the dragons through Orys, long-rumored half-brother to the Conqueror, and more explicitly, if any myth may be called explicit, through the marriage of Rhael Targaryen to Ormond Baratheon in an earlier century. The Baratheon brow thus wore a traced memory of Valyria, though black hair and blue eyes defied every herald who tried to paint it silver and purple. Meanwhile, the last confirmed Targaryens fled east, a prince and a princess carried on ships more frightened than seaworthy. Of those exiles, my purpose is not to rehearse the tales sung in dockside taverns about markets and marriages, slavers and sudden gifts. The reader knows as many and as few of those tales as I do, and those who pretend knowledge can rarely tell us their sources. What matters is that they lived and that survival made the bloodline a wandering creed rather than a citadel-bound fact. Here I must turn from sequence to structure, for a family tree without the laws of its garden is only a picture. The institutions that encased Targaryen blood accomplished three things. They defined who could beget, they guarded who had been begotten, and they judged between claimants when begettings displeased the realm. On the first question, who could beget, the royal exemption for incest is the most famous. Yet this exemption was never absolute. Practice waxed and waned with politics. Jaehaerys and Alysanne married their children according to friendship, prudence, and the availabilities offered by houses such as Baratheon, Hightower, and Valerion. Aegon foremarried freely and often outside the family's strictest norms, thereby pushing the problem of legitimacy into every village where his lust had rested. Aegon V attempted to free his line from the necessity of incest and thereby created the necessity of error. For every departure from long custom invites revolt, and revolt produces claimants in litters. The second function, guarding the begotten, fell to the Kingsguard and to the court. The White Sword Tower is a shrine to the fiction that an oath can stop fate. Rarely has so much steel been sworn to protect so few cradles. The Book of the White, kept by those sworn, reminds a sober reader that vows can be props in a play written by men with sharper quills. The third function, arbitrating succession, is where our sources are richest and least reliable. Great councils make law by letting lords pretend they are judges and not partisans. The Council of 101 upheld male preference primogeniture with enough fervor to silence a storm. The Council of 233 made of a hedge knight squire a king. In each case, procedure dressed preference, and preference often disguised fear. The fear in 101 was that Dorne and the sea would tug too hard at the throne through Rhaenys. The fear in 233 was that any claimant who spoke for the Blackfyres would reign without mercy toward the men who had fought them. The reliability of such decisions is a question only the unborn can answer, and they answer through consequence. When a chronicler says, "the realm accepted," he means that the losers went to their graves without sufficient allies to carry on the argument. In studying contradictions and reliability, I confess that my brothers often choose sides among the dead as if they were gaining patrons among the living. Septon Barth, rare fellow that he was, chose curiosity and paid for it in the derision of those who fear curiosity's cost. He writes that dragons, dreams, and blood mix in ways that embarrass rigid logician. Maester Gildane, compiling from second-hand notes and suspicious testimonies, writes against his own doubts, which makes him friendlier to me than most historians. The testimony of Mushroom, body as a bathhouse, tosses gold amongst filth. You must be willing to hold your nose to find it. Eustace, prideful and prim, gives us the perspective of the altar and confuses the altar with truth. My method, offered humbly, has been to prefer concordant detail over rhetorical flourish. When three sources who despise one another agree on who stood in which doorway at what hour, I consider that doorway real. When they agree only on the virtue or depravity of a prince, I grant the doorway a shadow and decline to assign a halo or horns. What emerges from all this reading is that a coherent chronology of the Targaryen bloodline is not a chain but a river with times of flood and drought. The first flood is the conquest and the decades that follow it, when the family's breeding patterns resemble a controlled experiment. The drought arrives with the dance and the death of dragons, when control reveals its limits. A second flood comes under Aegon IV, though it is not water but wine that spills. The river overflows its banks in bastards who will not stay in ditches. The Blackfyre risings are oxbows where the river loops back on itself, as if to revisit an argument it had already carried downstream. The Great Council of 233 is a pair of hands cupping the current to pour it into a new channel, setting Egg on a course his ancestors had not envisaged. Summerhall is a whirlpool. Jaehaerys to a short run of calm. Aerys to a stretch where the water grows strange and hot. Robert's rebellion is a forcing through a narrow gorge where many stones are broken. Beyond it, the stream spreads into an estuary of rumor and exile. To say that this is history is true, but it is not enough. A family so bound to prophecy always tried to make the river flow uphill. When it did not, it blamed the reshaping of the riverbed on enemies visible and invisible. There are unresolved questions that will trouble any mind that cares for tidy endings. The first and most notorious concerns the paternity of Rhaenyra's elder sons. A lord may dispute what a nurse knows. A nurse may misremember what a lord hopes. The coloring that caused whispers could be the accident of inheritance. Or perhaps it was not. The realm judged the matter not by evidence but by opportunity, and when opportunity turned, the rumors turned to weapons and names to warrants of execution. As one captain of the Gold Cloaks is said to have muttered, "The common folk do not care who begets a prince until they are asked to die for him, and then they care to the point of murder." The second unresolved question is the true extent of Targaryen offshoots. Dragonseed was neither rare nor reliably recorded. The official line, exerting itself to be narrow, left the margins to breed. That the blood appears in houses beyond the three classic Valyrian-descended families is no longer to be doubted by anyone who reads old claims in local courts along the Blackwater. Whether those appearances are meaningful is another matter. A fisherman's grandson might bear the silver hair and never feel heat differently than any neighbor. Another might mount a hatchling and discover a world reordered. A darker, unresolved question belongs to the late royal line. To what degree did prophecy steer decisions that men later blamed on passion? Rhaegar's conduct has been described by friends as the service of a design woven in texts older than the Hightowers. By enemies as the selfishness of a man who wanted to be sung about more than he wanted to rule. The truth, unpalatable to both, may be that he was a prince who discovered that when you search for meaning in augury you can always find justification for desire. Whether the child rumored to have been born from his union with Lyanna Stark lived or died, whether he bore a name whispered in towers or another whispered in crypts, has never been settled in ink. It is settled in tombs, and tombs are famously taciturn. The last unresolved question belongs to the present. Reports from across the narrow sea speak of fire reborn, of a young queen trading titles for armies, eggs for allies, then allies for smoke. Some swear dragons live again. I set down what their faces look like when they swear it, and that is all the certainty I can offer. If dragons do live, they will draw kin to them. If they do not, kings will pretend to the memory until pretending breaks their necks. Now to measure the institutions against their results. The royal exception for incest preserved the bloodline's outward markers: silver gold hair, violet eyes, not as reliably as legend would have you believe. Several princes were born who did not wear the family's most obvious badge. In any other house, such variation passes with a shrug. Among Targaryens, it could become material for treason. The Kingsguard, in binding 7 men to sacrifice, often created an arrogance in those guarded that made sacrifice necessary. The Book of Lineages, meticulous to the point of madness, turned a living tree into an inventory, useful for lawsuits and barren in spirit. The great councils gave the realm an idea of its own power, but that power is like a storm's, quick to move on, leaving wreckage for the carpenters. None of these institutions prevented catastrophe. None of them prevented continuity. The paradox is instructive. Men design contrivances to guarantee outcomes. Blood steward by contrivance continues, but never in the way contrivance intended. There is also the matter of adoption by influence, if I may use an awkward phrase. Certain houses, Valerian chief among them, treated proximity to the dragon as a tincture that might make them burn with reflected light. Intermarriages were numerous. Every generation required ships and coin, and Driftmark's coffers and harbors trained a habit of indispensability. The Celtigars, with their crab on a field as red as any sunset over Valyria's smoking hills, provided a pattern of old kin rendered useful by diligence rather than drama. In this fashion, the Targaryen bloodline was never only the Targaryens. It was an archipelago of families who shared customs, looks, and sometimes lovers. One might say the Targaryen project sought to keep the sea between those islands narrow. When those channels widened through misalliance, war, or plague, the islands grew separate, and the world called that separation peace. It is fashionable among certain penmen to attribute the line's peculiarities and collapses to madness as a hereditary trait, and then to hunt for it in every ancestor's sigh. The diagnosis is convenient but slovenly. What I see in the record is a different bequeathal, the inheritance of expectation. If your cradle is placed under a prophecy, you grow up under a blade. When the realm tells you that your blood allows you to break its laws, you will either grow timid and try to prove you can live within them, or you will grow arrogant and try to prove the realm cannot name you. Both choices can look like instability when set beside the unpoetic ledger of a steward who mates his children for dowry and alliance and thinks himself unremarkable. I cannot deny that certain kings showed cruel caprice and certain queens a reckless tenderness. Yet these look to me less like an illness than like the symptoms of being told you are not entirely human and then being tasked with acting human anyway. A chronicle is a net thrown over water. Let mine try to gather a few final fish. The bloodline begins in the shadow of the freehold's towers and lasts beyond their collapse because one father trusted a daughter's sight. Its first great age in Westeros is marked by the audacity to make law bow to inheritance rather than the other way around. Its middle age is marked by the attempt to refine that audacity into policy. This produced a garden of statutes that tried to graft Valyria onto the Undulls and the First Men, a graft that took only when weather allowed. The catastrophe that followed, the dance and the deaths of dragons, is an object lesson in how laws cannot restrain grief. The later age is one of multiplication without coherence. Bastards legitimized, bastards idealized, bastards exterminated, heirs made in the wrong beds, then punished for their parents. Summerhall is the hinge on which the last century swings. One of the few moments when the line tried to call back its oldest power by fire and found that fire, unlike law, cannot be cajoled. The end of their kingship did not end their blood. In this, they are like every royal house that falls. But theirs is unusual because their legend, old as smoke of Valyria, remains useful to ambitious men and women, so useful that strangers continue to hang their hopes and impostures from a branch that still seems green. Of the reliability of sources who tell us this of Barth, Gildane, Eustace, Mushroom, Caith, Melos, it is proper to report not whom they loved but what they could have known and where they wrote. Barth wrote inside a court where truth was a guest carefully seated. The servants heard more than he could set down, and to my ear he chose to hint rather than shout. Gildane compiled at a distance, and his guilt at loving a good anecdote shows in his caution. Eustace wrote for bishops with appetites for confession. Mushroom performed. Performers cannot afford to be dull, but dullness often shelters accuracy. Caith gathers lists the way others gather gossip and is thereby sometimes more valuable than he knows. Melos, Grand Maester as he was, wrote as if titles were evidence. They are not. My own bias, hopeless to uproot, is that power lies about blood more than blood lies about power. When a law tells you that a prince is legitimate, it tells you what men with swords will defend, not what gods in the marrow approve. Unresolved questions remain not only because witnesses perish, but because the realm needs questions to justify behavior. If Rhaenyra's boys were beyond doubt, half the speeches that justified half the slaughter vanish like mist. So the doubt is cultivated as carefully as a vineyard. If Orys Baratheon was the conqueror's half-brother in truth, as older gossip insists, then the Baratheon claim after the rebellion rests on a Machiavellian knot of blood and right that flatters victors. If he was not, then we are reminded that right may be written in the ink of victory. If a child of Lyanna Stark lived and bore a name tied to a prophecy, then every priest and prince who made or broke law in that era will construct his sermon anew. If not, then we have only what we already knew, that the realm tramples cradles when it panics. Whether dragons live again is a question that cuts deeper than spectacle. Their return would restore the old economy of awe, one family possessed of a terror that organizes the desires of nobles and the fears of peasants. Their absence forces the bloodline to seek legitimacy from the same instruments it once ignored: law, alliance, prosperity, and a reputation for safety. A measured conclusion must begin by refusing to flatter either enemies or lovers of the Targaryen line. The story is not of demons in human skin, nor of angels marooned among sinners. It is the story of a family that believed, not always wrongly, that it was charged with a labor larger than appetite. To keep human realms unified in a world where unity is dear. The methods they chose to preserve the capacity for that labor included practices that outraged both body and conscience, and those methods bred the very disasters they feared. Yet when they did not choose those methods, when they sought alliance beyond siblings and cousins, when they married prudently rather than mythically, their bloodline endured no less and often governed better. In this light, the sanctity of the blood looks less like a truth of nature than like a technology of rule. Technology, if the Citadel teaches anything, is a thing to be assessed by its outcomes. Fire cooks and burns. Law binds and strangles. A house willing to be judged only by its ends will always be tempted to lie about its means. Still, I resist the fashionable contempt that makes of every king a tyrant and of every lineage a swindle. If we ask what the Targaryen bloodline was, apart from its cosmetics and its romances, I answer, it was a long-standing conversation between power and restraint. Dragons made too easy a case for power. Prophecy made too easy a case for inevitability. The best of the line, men and women alike, understood that restraint is the sweeter strength. Alysanne walking the wall in the north, pleading for small mercy. Jaehaerys preferring deliberation to spectacle. Even Daeron the Young, who died for failure, tells us something about the nobility of wanting more than one's reach. The worst of the line shows us how restraint may be broken by fear wearing the mask of necessity. Ares too evokes only pity in those who do not fear him and only fear in those who cannot pity him. If I distinguish between the two sets of examples, it is because the bloodline's future, if it has one, will depend on which lessons the living descendants choose to learn. And there are living descendants, whether acknowledged by a court herald or by a mother with a scar that she runs her fingers over when the child sleeps. Some of those children will grow to be clerks. Some will die in plagues no chronicler cares to name. One or two might put a foot in a stirrup and feel the world tilt under them in a way that is not natural. If such a one finds a dragon, history will budge. If not, it will continue with the slow obstinacy of a mule. Either way, the phrase, blood of the dragon, will persist not because of what science can show in marrow or hair, but because men like to believe that greatness is inherited and guilt excusable by destiny. I leave to priests whether such belief displeases the gods. As for the Citadel, we are tasked not with blessing or curses but with understanding. My threadbare understanding, at the end, is this: the Targaryen bloodline survived not by being purer than other blood but by being harder to assimilate, a stubborn spice in the stew of the realm. Where it burned, it left scars that men point to when they wish to frighten children. Where it warmed, it kept winter off a while. So the mystery with which I began, what the blood meant, how it worked, why it mattered, must conclude not with an answer but with a posture. The posture is wary sympathy. Blood is a metaphor that became a discipline. A family chose to husband itself like a relic and then discovered that relics grow heavy. To the extent the realm allowed that choice, the realm shares its consequences. To the extent the realm resisted, the realm bears its scars. If one day a prince or princess of that line stands again before a city gate, hair like moonlight, eyes like amethysts, shouting promises into a crowd's upturned faces, I advise neither the easy surrender of awe nor the easy confidence of contempt. Ask instead what institutions will be built around that promise, whom they will protect, whom they will erase. Ask what the blood claims as its purpose, and then remember that blood cannot keep its own vows. Only people can. And people, in the end, are what the Targaryen story has always been about. Fallible, frightened, cunning, hopeful, dragging the future behind them like a stubborn dragon. Each step a negotiation between what was written and what is chosen. If I am permitted to dwell more minutely upon particular reigns, it is not to indulge the scholar's vanity for cataloging, but to illuminate how small, stubborn choices about marriage and naming, about midwives and household guards, shaped what later songs pretend was ordained. Jaehaerys and Alysanne remain my chief exhibit. Their union is praised for its longevity and the peace it tended. I praise it for its administrative imagination. The queen rode farther than any Targaryen woman had done since Visenya. But where Visenya carried a sword, Alysanne carried petitions, listening for the friction points where law met custom. She persuaded her lord to carve out the new gift to the Night's Watch not simply as royal largesse but as an adjustment to the old arithmetic of fealty at the margin of the realm. That gift looked, to contemporaries, like piety. To a genealogist it is a calculated investment. The wall would guard the blood indirectly by lowering the temperature of fear along the north, and fear is the solvent in which claims dissolve. The queen kept a small book, now lost, in which she noted how often women at outlying keeps named daughters for her and sons for her king. "Names are the poor man's heraldry," she wrote, if one may trust a maid of honor's later recollection. To watch names multiply is to watch allegiance thicken. The same reign reveals that incest, far from being a monolith, was a practice that could be modulated. Their children wed both within and without the family circle, and the pattern suggests an experiment conducted over a generation. What happens when dragon's blood is spliced to hardy riverstock, to Stormland iron, to Dornish grace? Jocelyn Baratheon's marriage to Prince Aemon produced Rhaenys, a girl whose claim, had it been upheld, would have anticipated a calmer course for the realm. Yet it was precisely the logic of modulation that made the lords wary, for a law built upon exception must be re-argued with every birth. Prince Baelin's fecundity with Alyssa Targaryen seemed, to the counselors who preferred predictability, a return to the old engine. Brother to sister, son to succeed, debate postponed. But postponed is not resolved. When Aemon died and Baelon followed, the realm returned to its fear of choice, and fear, like a cough ignored, became a fever that years later broke as the dance. As one aged lord of the Reach scribbled in the margin of his own copy of the lineages, "I want no more cleverness in bedchambers, the cleverness all ends in steel." The dance itself deserves more than a lament, for it is the crucible in which the popular understanding of Targaryen blood was revised downward. Before the war, the blood was imagined as a key that opened every lock. After, it was seen as a fire that burned the house that held it. I speak not of the court only. In the Riverlands, a thatcher named Pate, not our Pate, who would bridle at the coincidence, recorded that his village agreed, for the first time in living memory, to mark the births of children born during the Red Year with an ash sign over the door. He writes that they did not do this for piety but for ease of reckoning, so that when the men came with levies or taxes, we could make a show of counting our dead and push the reckoning down. Yet superstition will make of practicality a ritual soon enough. After the war, there is a measurable decline in willingness among middling houses to marry daughters toward the dragon. Even the Valerians, so long an axis of affinity, began seeking more breadth than height in their alliances. After Smoke, an admiral of that house observed in a letter to a cousin at court, "One prefers the sea breeze to the forge." There is a temptation among rhetorical minds to make dragon seed either an embarrassment or an apocalypse. It is neither. It is a function of proximity. A royal court packed with grooms, wet nurses, squires, and maids is a workshop of human entanglement, and a dynasty that deems itself exempt from the faith's constraints in one respect will find itself careless in others. That some of those unions produce children who could mount dragons is not alarming. It is clarifying. The blood's efficacy was not an on-off torch but a spectrum of capacity. Adam of Hull, raised up to be Valerion and then Prince of Dragonstone before the day turned and he died for the crown that made him, is the emblem of how elastic the category could be when the crown needed it. Nettles, who did not trouble heaven with theories and did not require a septon to number her ancestors, simply fed a hungry creature until it tolerated her touch. I have always thought it significant that she succeeded without any attested silver in her hair. The dragon knows, Septon Barth wrote in a private paper that survives only in a copy smuggled out by a sympathetic scribe. And if we do not, our ignorance is not a law. The court, unwilling to grant that their ignorance was anything but sacred order, tried to remove the evidence by banishment or carefully contrived deaths. Where erasure was attempted, legend later grew, as it always does. The later tangle of Aegon Ivy's offspring is an unlovely garden in which we must nevertheless walk, because it demonstrates how law metabolizes scandal. To legitimize a host of bastards, some of them born to rival mothers within earshot of one another, is to set a table for decades of sharpened knives. Demon, who bore himself with the electricity of a man who has discovered in his body a banner enough to gather friends, became the instrument of a grievance the king himself had sown. The sword Blackfire is treated by the credulous as if it were a confession signed in Valyrian steel. It is not. It is a potent sign in an illiterate political culture. As an old lord of the Crownlands explained when summoned by Daeron II to account for his youthful flirtation with the rebel standard, "A sword you can see, a writ you must accept on another man's honor." That the legal doctrine remained firm, primogeniture within the legitimate line, no matter how prudent or imprudent the man who sat the throne, did not diminish the energy of the rebels. Law can tell you who should win. It has no voice loud enough to stop men from trying. Igor Rivers and Brynden Rivers, apt fog for men with names like Rivers, sharpen the point. The one made himself a banner for revenge. The other made himself an instrument of order, as harsh and unmusical as a night watchman's stick. Both were bastards. Both were indisputably of the blood. Both acted as if legitimacy were a moral property that could not be given by a crown or taken by a statute. Angry writing about them mistakes character for policy. I find it more useful to say that both men believed the Targaryen story meant something specific. Bittersteel believed it meant that might should crown the best swordsman who could claim a seed of the dragon. Bloodraven believed it meant that might should protect the fragile idea that law, once declared, cannot be reinterpreted every time a handsome claimant appears. Sharera Seastar sits at the edge of their tale like a moon making a tide, indispensable to their poetry, missing from the paperwork. There are women who are the space between lines. A later Archmaester wrote with unusual warmth. I include her here because breeding and blood in this dynasty were never confined to marriage contracts. They were also rumors, rooms, and the realms of appetite where the state keeps no clerks. The Great Council of 233, which lifted a hedge-born prince to the loftiest seat in the realm, is at once the strongest vindication of legality and its most telling confession of contingency. Egg was royal enough for the letter of the law and acceptable enough for the anxieties of the powerful. The council rejected nearer kin whose personalities threatened to make peace impossible. That is to say, blood was a necessary condition but not a sufficient one, and the missing sufficiency was not virtue but governability. The minutes of that council, dry as oatcakes, still reveal a human drama when read against the grain. We must have a king who will sign what is set in front of him, one lord of the West urged according to a secretary's scribble, and not one who will set fire to the table. That the boy they chose became the man who lit Summerhall is the kind of iron. Why in which history abounds and from which law is forever trying to excuse itself. Summerhall remains a negative image, burned into the plate, of everything the bloodline believed about itself. The materials gathered there, rare woods, oils, casks with symbols still debated, a clutch of eggs that had not quickened in generations, make of the king's act not madness but method. He thought, as alchemists do. A journeyman glassmaker wrote in a letter to his guildmaster after repairing lanterns in the ruins, that if a thing will not become what it was, the fault is in the manner of urging, and so he changed the manner. That men died, that a child was born in storm, that a prince sang while the smoke took shape. All of this we have in pieces from people who ran in different directions at different speeds. It is the nakedness of intention that matters to my subject. The dynasty's story at Summerhall declares that blood without dragons had grown intolerable to itself. The return of fire was not sought simply to awe enemies. It was wanted to quiet a conscience and relieve a terror that the family's distinctiveness had become an empty vessel. Ares too inherits that terror and transforms it into a theater in which he plays both priest and sacrifice. The early reforms that marked the briskness of a new reign are real enough. The later descent into scalding suspicion is at once courtly gossip and a structure of policy. When a king will not permit knives near his person and will not trust the line of attendants set to bring in his meals, he is declaring an estate of exception within an estate of exception. In making his sister wife pregnant again and reading each infant as an augury rather than a person, he reduces blood to an instrument of prophecy. Those who label this madness domesticate it. It is something more orderly and more frightening. A man convinced that his ends require the constant mortification of the means. He took the sacrament of kingship as if it were an oath to never descend to human. Wrote a court singer in exile, whose surviving pages carry the ache of someone who wanted to love what could not be defended. Rhaegar's portion in the tale is always asked to bear more weight than is fair. He is made to be the hinge upon which the door swings, either because he misread the stars or because he read them aright and chose a cruelty disguised as duty. I have listened to men argue whether he loved Elia Martell and whether love would have exonerated him if he did. They put into his heart their own excuses. Of greater relevance to the Bloodline study is that he acted as if a prophecy about a prince that was promised were a brief to reorganize lives. And then he discovered, as every scholar of augury does, that language will bend to desire. It is not that he sinned. Most men do. It is that he believed the sin to be a sacrament. The difference lands in cradles as clearly as any horse's hoofbeat on a winter road. I have perhaps written too sternly about religion, so let me honor the faith where it warrants respect. The faith militants rising against the early incestuous marriages was a crude thing in its instruments, but the doctrine beneath it, that men of power must not be permitted to invent holiness to justify their appetites, is not trivial. The compromise with J. Harry's eye, the washing of the royal bed in language that made the exception dignified rather than sordid, was a victory for prudence as much as for the throne. We shall save the people from the king by making the king a parable, Septon Oswick wrote in a commentary used to train prelates for 2 centuries. I suspect he meant it both as warning and as hope. The Septons of the countryside, whose sermons shaped how small folk understood the words "blood of the dragon," tended to preach that the exception bound the kings more strictly to mercy than it did other men, as if the price of their difference was a perpetual obligation to be kinder than their subjects. If this was never quite realized, it is nevertheless a helpful expectation to hear murmured in markets. It bends behavior at the margin. I turn now to the craft of record-keeping, because the shape of the bloodline on parchment is itself a form of power. The book of lineages in the Red Keep is tidy as a mason's chalk line. I admit a grudging admiration for the steady hands that copied, amended, and erased. But our citadel's more discreet volumes, midwives' logs, leech lists, the less public ledgers in which medicines are tallied against stillbirths and fevers, tell a parallel story. In those pages one can count clusters of miscarriages following unions of close kin and see, with a cruelty that documents cannot remove, the cost of purity paid in small heaps of grief. One can also see how marriages that widened the circle, Baratheon, Hightower, Martell, brought stretches of healthier infants to wet nurses' arms. Consanguinity makes for greater certainty in law and greater hazard in bones, wrote Vagon, the king's son turned archmaester, in a lecture that was not widely copied because too much truth is ungenteel. I do not draw from this a sermon. I draw only the reminder that love of a house and love of the children inside it do not always ask the same rituals. Another dimension of preservation rarely discussed is naming, that quiet art by which families summon ghosts to guard or guide the living. The Targaryens named relentlessly within a narrow lexicon. Aegon and Aemon and Balon, Visenya and Rhaenys, Dina and Daenerys, Riella and Riella's daughter. To speak a name is to rehearse an argument. When Viserys named Rhaenyra, he demanded that the future pronounce a syllable the Great Council had not chosen. The realm hesitated and, like a poor student, answered the wrong question when the exam was set. When Aegon IV named Daemon and placed a blade in his hand, he made a word into a wedge. After the fall, the persistence of these names in households far from court. One finds Aemon's and Daenerys's in the tallies of dockworkers at Gulltown and on the fingers of shepherd girls in the shadow of the mother, suggests a diaspora of aspiration. Parents place a coin in the child's mouth with a name. An Old Town midwife told a novice who kept notes beyond her duties, and hope the gods will change it to gold. Comparisons are instructive. The Triarchs of Volantis boast an old blood that signals not incest but a hierarchy enforced by slavery and custom. Their genealogies are swelling rivers of private contracts, not public rights, and that difference produces a politics much less concerned with singular lineages than with gorged clans. Cohorian records, such as they are, reveal a guild-like approach to descent. Families trace craft more meticulously than they trace blood, and marriage follows apprenticeship more often than passion. Braavos, founded upon flight from Valyrian practice, is the least interested in exceptional blood, which is one reason its brokers proved so effective in trading information about Targaryen exiles. The pure-born of Qarth preach a doctrine of heredity as theater. Their palanquins glitter with ancestry, Yet even their own servants cannot explain who is cousin to whom. In this gallery, the Targaryens are unusual not only for their incest but for their insistence that blood should translate directly to governance without the mediation of guild, senate, or compact. That this worked for centuries tells us less about biological difference than about the sociology of fear in a world where men have seen cities burned from the sky. I pause to mention language, for the blood carries speech as well as feature. High Valyrian at court was never simply a flourish. It was a ritual of distinction. Decrees framed in the old tongue could be passed hand to hand among the learned, while small folk waited for translations that came shaped by the translator's politics. A wry master of coin in a late reign jotted in the margin of an account. To say a tax in High Valyrian makes it feel older and therefore less negotiable. The same is true of prophecy. Verses preserved in a mellowed tongue sound more faded than instructions written in the common speech of bakers and butchers. Reagers reported readings from older scrolls, whose very lettering would have made dissent seem like rudeness to an old aunt, thus acquired the glamour of antiquity that modern argument cannot puncture. I recommend humility. Languages dignify, they do not absolve. Women are too often footnotes in these matters, and in Targaryen studies such exclusion is particularly obtuse, for the line's decisive turns run through their bodies and choices. Visenya's flinty patience made room for Aegon's generalship to appear gentler than it was. Rhaenys's wit softened the lords to their new condition. Alysanne converted the North not by doctrine but by attention. Dina the Defiant demonstrated that confinement is a poor way to contain a spirit raised to believe its blood makes laws, and the consequences of her confinement and release ripple outward into questions of succession that the court preferred to settle by silence. Sarah's flight to Lys, often recorded with prim disapproval, is of a piece with the pattern by which women who do not fit the marriage arithmetic are reassigned to the periphery, where their allure can be monetized and their progeny ignored until inconveniently useful. Helena's sorrow, faced, like so many royal griefs, with the twin brutalities of public curiosity and private neglect, reminds us that the body made into an emblem is still a body. If I sound doctrinaire, forgive me. It is an old scholar's impatience with ledgers that translate women into arrows on a tree. I have said less than I ought about the practical economy of dragons. When dragons lived in number, they were not only weapons, they were expenditures. The dragon pit cost coin enough to build 2 keeps in the river country, and the feed for even a small clutch of beasts would strain a granary in a poor harvest. The tithe of flame, a scribe of the master of coin called it, and he tabulated the cost of sheep and cattle diverted from markets to maws. A king who holds a dragon must persuade his lords that their barns will not be emptied for spectacle. Jaehaerys' success in this was neither luck nor the result of a docile realm. It was administration. He alternated displays with restraint, made of fire and occasional punctuation rather than a daily grammar. The dance ruined that calculus. When every lord expects fire to decide what argument cannot, sending food to the pit feels like treason to one's children. By Aegon III's reign, the political will to subsidize the possibility of dragons had evaporated. The sorrow of that boy's face in portraits is, I think, not only mourning for the beasts but also a way for court painters to signal that the realm had ceased to believe it could afford such an appetite. We must say a word about the North, where the blood met a different weather of law. The Targaryens rarely sought marriages into houses whose gods still peered out from trees, and when they did, the marriages were symbolic more than strategic. Yet Alysanne's success in softening northern hesitation suggested a model that the court never fully adopted. Treat remoteness as dignity rather than shame it as backwardness. They came with fire and left with a promise, a northern matron told a Septon who tried to shame her for refusing a southern match. The promise was that they would not make us into them, and then they forgot. That forgetting has a cost. Bloodlines do not live on sunlight and hair alone. They require a culture in which difference is felt as protection rather than as provocation. The Targaryens were at their most secure when they permitted the realm to feel that the royal peculiarities insulated rather than threatened local ways. It is a subtlety easily lost at a court that confuses awe with affection. The diaspora east after the rebellion is a chapter easy to romanticize, which is why I will write of it coldly. Exile changes blood from a foundation into a currency. You spend it to buy ships, captain's patience, Sellsword's vows, and harbor master's blind eyes. The value fluctuates with rumor. A prince becomes dearer after a tavern brawl in Pentos goes the right way. A princess's worth waxes when a merchant of Karth boasts that his daughter saw an egg turn warm in her lap. The bureaucrats of Bravos know this better than anyone. They track exiles with a banker's indifference to romance. In their gray ledgers, one can see moments where assistance rose because a Targaryen name could be dangled before Volantine rivals, and moments where assistance was cut because unrest in the stepstones made volatility a poor investment. Blood is a commodity, a Bravosi factor wrote to his master, and like all commodities it spoils when there is too much of it on the market. He meant that too many claimants divide attention and depress price. He wrote more truth than he intended. I remain haunted by a small document that will not impress anyone who likes grand causes. It is the inventory of a midwife's kit recovered from a burned home near the Windwater during the dance. The list is nothing. Swaddling 2 lengths of boiled twine, a knife kept in a leather fold, a small carved dragon of bone. The last is the hook. The midwife or the mother believed that placing the carving near an infant's head would lend it luck or valor or some spark. The blood of the dragon, then, was already a talisman for peasants who had not seen a royal procession and could not read the edicts that explained the exception. When the court quarreled, the people knitted courage from whatever was to hand. Such tokens do not make a prince, but they make a populace that will receive a prince with a story already in mind. That can be as consequential as a council's decree. If a coherent chronology requires a final pass, let it be this, stated without the embroidery that tempts a pen as it tires. Enar flees at his daughter's word and preserves a line. Aegon brings sisters and dragons west and forges a throne and the doctrine that their blood bends law. Aenys and Maegor dramatize the perils of too little and too much force in domestic questions. Jaehaerys and Alysanne translate myth into administration. The Council of 101 preserves male preference while pretending to have discovered it, planting time bombs in language that will later detonate. Viserys refuses to let the future be other than what he named. The future refuses to obey. The dance burns beasts and certainties. Aegon III reigns amid ash. Daeron I dies in glory and failure. Baelor sanctifies his family almost into oblivion. Viserys II rebuilds sinew. Aegon forspreads seed and poison. Daeron II knits Dorne into the garment. The Blackfires cut at the seams. The Great Council of 233 makes egg possible. Summerhall makes everything after uncertain even to those who lived it. Jaehaerys II trims and binds. Aerys II unbinds until he burns. The Baratheon claim folds older rumors into new banners. The exiles make of blood a letter of credit. Reports of dragons reintroduce the ancient leverage of fear to markets that had learned to discount it. There are unresolved questions that I have not exhausted and never shall. Did Aegon the Conqueror harbor a dream of darkness in the far north that bent his course from the first? Or is this a retrofitting by later kings who wished to sanctify conquest by necessity? One scrap, attributed to a hand close to Jaehaerys II, speaks of a burden passed in whisper from king to heir, that fire must be kept for the night. It is suggestive, not dispositive. Did any of the dragon seeds who rose in the dance leave lines that now live in quiet hamlets as horsebreakers and charcoal burners? Almost certainly. Would those lines quicken in the presence of a dragon, or has the capacity thinned past use like iron beaten too many times? No one can say without the beast. Was Orys Baratheon a brother to Aegon in fact or merely in fable? The archive yields only nods and winks. One cook's ledger that notes the king's habit of sending the same dishes to both men when indisposed. A lord's letter that calls Orys that other arm of the king. Nothing that a court of law would accept and everything that folklore loves. Did a child born of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen live to make any of this more than argument? The silence where certainty would be is either the most prudent mercy in a century of noise or the most consequential error. There are truths that kingdoms cannot afford. A hand once observed after a sleepless night. He knew his trade. A measured ending, then, even if the topic refuses to end. The Targaryen bloodline is a story about the uses to which a people can put a myth when the myth is lodged in the bodies of their rulers. It is also about the cost of letting those rulers believe the myth absolves them from the labor of governing. The house endured when its members behaved as gardeners of a hard-to-grow vine and failed when they acted as priests of a flame that needed only worship. It prospered when it treated law as a friend that helps you over rough ground and perished when it treated law as a pageant for the enthralled. I do not know if dragons live, though I have looked at faces that believe they did and seen in those faces the relief of men who think the world has regained a hinge. Whether with wings or without, the future will present some claimant with the right hair and the right eyes and the right story. If that claimant builds institutions that ask less of bodies and more of customs, if they protect midwives and maesters and taxmen as carefully as they polish crowns, the blood will prove a servant rather than a master of their purpose. If not, the realm will be asked again to trade its sons and daughters for a vision. My counsel is unfascio. Nable in an age that prefers trumpets to bells. Keep your counsels broad, your books honest, and your altars modest. Blood is a cunning advocate. Do not let it plead without cross-examination. Because I began in doubt, I will end in gratitude for doubt. Doubt saved the line at the start when a father doubted the safety of an empire. Doubt tempered a zealot's lash and led a king to listen to a queen. Doubt made a council consult the realm before swords answered. Doubt walked along a wall with a woman whose mind outran the age. If ever a dragon's shadow passes over a field in which men bend their backs, let doubt be the harvest that does not fail. It will not make a handsome song. It may keep the next book of lineages from becoming a list of funerals. And if in some village a midwife still tucks a bone-carved dragon into a cradle, I hope it is not to beg destiny but to remind the parents that they, too, keep a kind of fire, and that the child will need both warmth and boundaries if it is to grow into anything that merits a chronicler's ink.